I'm Shailendra Gupta. I'm the Director of Client Services at Mashery, and I'm really happy to have this opportunity to talk about managing your platform and considering things that are really important, things like security, support, definition of the platform itself. And these things, as you roll out your platforms, you folks may be in various stages of that process right now, but very important elements to think about at the outset. And tying into what Chuck said, right, as you define some of these things, you will get a better understanding of how the different pieces fit together. So hopefully there's some useful information here during my talk today. Foundations of API management and security. So a couple of topics we'll be covering today. Definition of the API itself. So you may have defined the landscape of your users, who's going to interact with your API, what the different systems might be out there, and that will really tie into how you, from a nuts and bolts perspective, define what your API is going to be. As part of that definition, you'll also want to think about how you scale out your API program, right? We all want our APIs to succeed, and when they do become successful, the challenge of scale is an interesting one. So something to consider as you get into it. Security. Well, what are the different security issues that you may run into, right? Having some idea of the space that you're operating in is going to help inform that conversation. Managing your platform as it's deployed. How are you going to monitor and manage the usage? Who the different audiences are or consumers are for your API? How are you going to manage them? And then supporting the platform, right? Like Chuck said, your API is a product, and like any product, needs to be supported. So there are important things to consider when you get into supporting the platform as well. So defining of the API itself, right? As Chuck mentioned, it is very closely tied to your API strategy. Understanding what your business goals are, what your API landscape is, who are you targeting, what kind of resources you need. All of those things are going to be important as you start defining what your API needs to look like, behave as, getting that organizational buy-in. So assembling everything you need from a organization process perspective needs to happen. And it's not to say that in a lot of cases, sometimes there are going to be technical innovations that fuel some of these other conversations. So it's not necessarily top-down that you have your business fully defined, and that's when you go in and sequentially build out the API itself. There might be technical innovations that you see outside of your organization that can help fuel some of the conversations on the business side. So talking about the nuts and bolts of what an API actually needs to be. You've heard the conversation about REST versus SOAP. Very often, I'm sure. It's not necessarily one technology versus the other, right? It's always evaluating the merits of a particular tool or technology against what purpose you're trying to serve. So again, going back to the landscape of where your API is going to operate. As an example, right, if you have resources in-house that are proficient in, say, working with SOAP technologies, and the partners that you're going to integrate with are predominantly, well-versed in working with SOAP technologies, well, for your initial use case, it certainly makes sense to pursue that route. Flip side, if you are going to be working with a lot of developers who are, say, building mobile applications, right? In those cases, a REST-style type of interface, JSON support, XML support makes sense. So again, tying this back to the actual objectives of your API. And you don't have to build everything right out the gate. So the important thing to keep in mind here is, as you go about this journey, is it is a product that is going to evolve over time. So you don't have to get it right, just right out the gate from an offering perspective. What is important is supporting that through a feedback process and continuing to evolve that product. What types of API operations or methods you're going to make available. So you may have an API that you use internally as well, but may not be everything that you'd like to expose externally. So example, you have a catalog service. You don't necessarily want to expose the ability to update your catalog to your external partners or developers, right? You'd want to retain control of that in-house. But the ability to search that catalog is something that you'd want to make available perhaps to the broader community. So again, carving out what those building blocks are is an important aspect of definition of the API itself. Lifecycle management. So as with any product, it is going to change over time. You're going to have consumers who are using, a prior version. How are you going to manage the lifecycle and your relationships with your consumers as the API program changes or the API itself changes? So, there are approaches like explicit versioning. You're maintaining V1, V2, V3 of your APIs. Certainly there's an overhead of running those multiple versions in parallel. Or there are also approaches where versioning is kind of intrinsic to the platform itself. So using, say, content negotiation, someone could request a version 1 of a resource or version 2 of a resource. Again, convenient, but certainly does have the overhead of maintaining all of that capability or backwards compatibility for your consumers. But the lifecycle aspect of it is certainly very important. So it's something that needs to be thought through very clearly. Again, it is a product. You do not want to switch from one version to the other, not have a good plan in place to manage how your existing consumers are going to move from version 1 to the next version as you deprecate those versions. So communication around that. And we'll talk a little bit about what's important from a support perspective. Scale. So very important. Our APIs, we all hope, become really successful. We're all in the billionaires club, driving a lot of return on investment and a lot of successful applications, right? What is the, I guess, challenge that opportunity introduces, right? The challenge of scale. So how quickly you can actually scale to meet those demands is an important aspect of your API platform design itself. So, a good approach is to be able to set up your API platform stacks in a manner that they are very much independent, right? So you've got, say, an entire application stack with, say, databases that you can replicate as needed. So you've got horizontal scaling built into your application. Now, obviously, with a model like that, the shortcoming is that, yes, if you have read-only APIs, sure, you could replicate everything. There's only read-only data, but what happens if there's write data? So certainly, problem becomes more complex. How do you manage the transactions as they're being done in one part of the applications versus the other part? So the ability to handle that type of scenario is going to be important depending on what your scaling model looks like. Now, you could also scale in a manner that really assumes that you're going to handle huge spikes in traffic and you just provision enough capacity to handle that. So obvious, I guess upside is that you're always ready for any type of spikes, but what happens when moderate traffic is flowing through the system? You've just over provisioned and your cost to manage your infrastructure is fairly high. So as Chuck pointed out, a lot of tools out there these days, API management, that can help offload some of those capabilities. So taking your available capacity and allocating it across a distributed set of partners or consumers. So things like rate limiting, right? Or caching, for that matter, can help with offloading a lot of the capabilities. So we talked about scaling, right? And from a scale perspective, traditionally we've all built, servers, built them in our data centers or standard hosting environments. But over a period of the last couple of years, the cloud has become a more trustworthy and reliable way to deploy. So from a cost perspective, as a lot of developers or folks starting up, tech companies, the ability to deploy in the cloud is fairly cost efficient. So that is certainly one of the things that you should consider as long as it fits into your overall infrastructure model, right? There was a time when there was just a lot of mistrust of the cloud, right? No, we can't deploy in the cloud. There are security risks. How will we be compliant with security standards, say, PCI DSS, for example, right? These days, yes, there are cloud providers who are PCI DSS compliant. So if there are concerns around those type of areas, certainly pick a provider that can meet your requirements. And then leverage that capability. Because again, with the cloud, you can deploy rapidly, you can replicate and add redundancy and distribute globally as well, right? So the nice thing is that you've got providers that are distributed globally, and you can leverage the infrastructure across the board. And caching is another important thing that the cloud providers will provide as well. So if you're using like an API management tier to help with that scale portion of the equation, then offloading a lot of the caching to an API management tier can significantly improve your performance as well. And security. So security, again, a lot of flavors of security. Some related to, say, financial data, some related to health, personal health information. What type of standards are your API going to be held accountable to, right? So going back to the definition of the API itself, a really important consideration is to recognize, again, the landscape in which you're operating and building your security model against that. So you'll run into cases where, say, you're dealing with untrusted applications, right? A lot of mobile applications, a lot of tablet applications being built. How do you trust these applications, right? Are you going to let your end users of your services actually provide their username and passwords to these applications, right? Probably not a good idea. As an end user myself, I would be hesitant to provide my credentials for, even say my Facebook account or my Twitter account to an application built by an unknown developer. So things like OAuth, for example, that allow for delegated authorization, protecting your credentials are things that you should certainly consider as well as you design your API. Preventing attacks. So as you scale, you've made your API available. It's being consumed by a lot of your partners and consumers. You're soon enough going to be a target for some undesirable traffic, right? So you're going to see routine traffic spikes or, say, denial of service type of attacks. Or there are going to be folks who are going to just try and do security exploits against your system to extract information about your end users, for example, or get them to do things that are in their interest, but basically jeopardize the security framework of your system. So again, from that perspective of preventing the attacks, you could, again, scale out your own systems, build it out so that you can handle those cases where there is a denial of service attack. Or you could, say, offload that capability to an API management type of layer. So again, with the API management type of layer sitting in front of your systems, you get that protection where, yes, the traffic will never reach you. It is only the good traffic that makes it to your systems, and it's really a buffer that is protecting you against all of this unwanted traffic. The other aspect of security, obviously, there are a lot of standards out there that have been around for a long time. So transport layer security, for example. So if there's data that is going to be subject to being sniffed while it's being transmitted, be it credit card information, or be it just contact information or personal information, personally identifiable information. How do you secure that? So if the API is going to be transmitting any of that type of information, standards like SSL, fairly common, not expensive to get the certificates. Certainly make sure that you have your API secured using SSL. As Chuck had pointed out, there are ways to make your API available, providing API keys to your partners and consumers. But then the question comes up, well, what happens if my key is compromised? Someone else could be using my key, and especially if it's a paid API program, right? I've gone out and bought 1,000 calls for X dollars from people, for example, and now someone else has sniffed my key, and they're basically using using my key to operate their service. So there's things like digital signatures, pre-shared secrets that you can use as well that, again, along with SSL can help protect that. So the key while transmitted, there's a signature that's available as well, or that's required to be sent as well, that can protect your overall ability to send those API calls. So while in the case of a pure key-based model, that risk exists. If you're not using SSL, if you're using shared secrets as well, then even in a non-SSL model, at least you do get some level of protection. Then there are going to be things within the API itself that you want to be, recognize as some risks, right? So things like either SQL injection, right? How do you protect against those? Those are types of things that you want to build within your own API layer. Verbose error responses. So someone could be deliberately making calls against your API, and in the headers that are returned, there is enough information for them to figure out, what your backend servers are, or IP addresses that are being exposed. So there's detailed error messages that are being served back that could allow someone to potentially exploit your system. So there are, best practices around making sure that any of the information that is coming back as a part of either a successful response or a error response does not expose the internals of your API or your systems. So we talked a little bit about OAuth. I do have a link here that I'm just going to click into to walk you through a quick demo of an OAuth type of setup here. So Inkdit, one of our customers, actually uses IO docs, which Neil will be talking about in more detail. But for the moment, just to give you an idea of how OAuth could be used to protect your services. So what Inkdit does is it provides online signing, right? Kind of like an e-sign type of process. And what they've done is I, as a developer, have my credentials here, and I have my Mashery demo site, and client ID, client secret that are populated here. At this point, I'm going to go ahead and authorize this particular application, which is an untrusted application as far as I'm concerned. And what this does is it will basically make a request back into, and we have a pop-up blocker here. Let's go ahead and clear that. This is going to actually ask me as the end user to authorize this application. So because it is an untrusted application, I as an end user do have to authorize it. So I could go ahead and type in my username, password. So what I've done is I've authenticated myself against the Inkdit service. It's brought up my name, and I just need to, I guess, make this window a little bigger here. But it's giving me the option of authorizing this application either as myself or the company I'm associated with. So be it Mashery or be it myself. And fortunately, it seems like the screen is not big enough for me to actually get to the authorize button here. Yeah. Huh. All right. Yes, thank you. All right, let's go ahead and allow this application. And what's happened at this point is the application's been authorized, my credentials have been accepted by Inkdit, have not been provided to the untrusted application. There's a temporary token that's been provided here for this application, and the application, if it were to now run in my context, it goes ahead and makes this call, fetches my information as the individual. So again, certainly a good option to consider when you're going out and building applications or making APIs available that will be consumed by applications in an untrusted environment. So as you have your API out there, it's being consumed, how how is it actually being used? Is it a successful API program? Are you getting the benefits that you set out at the outset? So all the things that Chuck mentioned, right? Be it return on investment or business objectives like driving innovation. Who's helping you drive that innovation? How do you keep track of that? So a few things that are important as you roll this out to facilitate that end-to-end story is making it easy for developers and consumers to get entrenched or get engaged into the system. So providing them the ability to get onboarded so that they can get access to their system. So using like a developer portal, as we saw some of the nice examples out there. Controlling usage or access to the API itself. So there are a few dimensions to that, right? So you've got, say, straightforward rate limiting types. Someone can get X calls per day, someone else can get Y calls per day, what those different rate limits or access levels might be. But beyond that, there might be resources that you'd like to restrict as well. How are you going to make sure that it's only your trusted partners that can access or have the ability to update your product catalogs, but developers who are building, say, applications to just showcase your product catalog can only read from that information, securing those resources. So that's where tools like, say, like an API management layer that does provide you the ability to take your API product, provide you the different levels of access, and package it up nicely to make available to your consumers is certainly useful. So as an example, if you do have, say, access tiers, right? So you've got Label API, so Food Essentials is an organization. They make information about the nutritional facts about, commonly found packaged food products available, right? And in order to use this API, you have a few different flavors of being able to consume it. Making that information available as you've set up to the consumers of the service itself. What are those different tiers? What do people get in those different tiers? So you've set yourself up to provide those levels of access, and now you're communicating that to the consumers of your API. Reporting on the API as it's being used. So you've built it up, a solution that is well-designed, it is scalable, it is secure, you've packaged it up nicely, and now you'd like to see, well, what is really being used? Is it serving the purpose that you'd hoped it would serve? So being able to monitor what is actually going on with the API. Trending across time periods, right? How many calls have been made over a certain period of time? Who is actually making those calls? And what are they making those API calls for? So what will drive, or what this data will really drive for you is a lot of the business or innovation discussions, right? Is a certain developer driving so much traffic but also delivering a lot of value for you that it makes sense to set up commercial arrangements with such a developer or partner? Or if someone is driving a lot of traffic but not really delivering any of the benefits that you have in terms of business objectives, then do you need to review their level of access and move them from, say, one tier down to a lower tier of access? So getting insights into what's happening in the API program, again, it's part of the operationalization of your API platform and how you externalize it. So visibility into that data is very important. So leading into supporting the platform. So you've got the data that is informing you how your platform is being used, what aspects of it are effective. So you may uncover from that data that there are certain API methods that are hardly being used. Why is that happening? So getting that feedback from the consumers of the API, which as Chuck mentioned and Neil will talk to a little bit more as well, is do you need to make changes to the API? So perhaps the ability to make a certain API call is so cumbersome, or the security model around it is so cumbersome that it's very difficult for people to use, and so there's low adoption. But that particular API method, it might be like a checkout service for a retailer, right? That is your ROI point right there. If someone cannot check out, well, defeats the entire purpose. But if that process is so cumbersome that not a lot of people are able to build to it, then do you need to re-engineer that? So those are very important feedback points to incorporate into the evolution of the API product itself. And then keep in mind the lifecycle management of it, right? How, as it moves from, say, one version to the other, how you are going to continue to maintain that backwards compatibility. So from a support standpoint, you've got the infrastructure or operational aspect of supporting the platform. So like no other type of software that you may have deployed, the API platform itself needs to be supported. So the usual aspects around, managing the uptime of your services, having a support structure in place of what happens when there is an outage. Do you have a team that is available to support your platform? Because you can't just put the platform out there, and if the API goes down, well, we don't know who's going to support it, right? And people are scrambling, trying to get the network guys on, trying to get the application developers who built the application on the phone, and nobody really knows what to do there, right? So having a cohesive strategy around how you will support this in an operational mode is very important. So you've got that infrastructure level type of support, and then you've got support from a consumer standpoint as well, right? So the API, again, being your product, and the consumers of that product, the basic tenets of good customer service would apply, right? So providing them good tools and documentation to tools such as like IODocs that you saw, and you'll see more of as well later today, and good documentation. A lot of things that Chuck mentioned in his talk about making the experience for your consumers as efficient and beneficial to that relationship, right? How are you going to communicate with your community? So, there might be new versions that get released of the API or new features that get released. How are you going to communicate those, right? So either blog updates, email newsletters. What has changed in the API, right? You don't want someone's app to stop working without any prior, I guess, warning, right? So if you've made the effort to communicate with your consumers how this platform is changing from version X to version Y, what's being deprecated, that needs to be communicated. So a communication plan that is part of the overall API management is also important. When there are issues, right? So you're trying to get your API service back up and running, or even when there's, say, scheduled maintenance and you expect downtime, keeping your consumers informed of what is going to happen, when it's going to happen, and what the potential effects are for them, right? More sensitive in cases where you've got real revenue running over the API, right? Say you've got a commerce API. If it's going to be down for several hours during a peak, retail season time, well, that's not going to be a good thing for everyone, right? So planning around that and communicating ahead of time what the impacts are, how people are going to be impacted is critical. Feedback tools. So some of the developer portals, API management tools that are available will provide things like forums, commenting capabilities. So getting feedback on how the API is actually serving its purpose. And it's not just about having a forum out there and allowing folks to come and post there. If you're not going to monitor and not going to respond to that, it's not going to work out too well. So again, basic customer service. If you're using email addresses to solicit any type of communication from your consumers, then the email address should be monitored, right? It shouldn't be a black hole where people are sending emails and nobody's doing anything about it. Could be issues or anything odd happening with the API program. Social media sites. So gone are the days when your consumers are engaging with you on just your hosted website. They are going to be out there and everywhere. How do you keep track of what's going on where? So again, depending on who you're targeting, say if you're working with open developers, there are going to be set of sites that they usually frequent, right? Making sure that you have, as a part of your internal team, folks who can manage and monitor what is being posted about your API. in those sites, and actually being able to engage with your consumers on those sites as well. So being responsive, providing them the information they need, and using that as a feedback tool as well. So community engagement and outreach. So this is basically talking about the consumer community, how you will be dealing with them as you make your API programs available. So the term API community is very broad, right? Depending on your API program, it could be very partner-based. It could be partner-based and open developer. It could be very much open developer. The fundamental rules of how you engage with these tend to be very common, right? Providing the right tools and documentation, providing good systems to make sure that your API systems are healthy, up and running, communicating how things are going to change in the API program. And Neil's going to come and talk about a little bit more in terms of details around the community engagement and outreach. And a couple of resources here. You can find me afterwards, lunchtime or during the afternoon, and I would be glad to answer any questions that you have. All right.